Welcome to Sissy Fantasy World, where every story sparkles. Don't forget to subscribe for more magic. I never thought a single morning could change the way I saw myself, the way I moved through the world. I woke to sunlight spilling through the blinds, hitting the floor in long stripes that seemed to stretch toward me, almost like they were reaching for a version of me I hadn't met yet. My reflection in the small bathroom mirror felt off, as though the person staring back was a draft, a sketch waiting for details. And then the box arrived. I didn't remember ordering it, didn't remember even signing for it. But it was there, wrapped in plain brown paper, tied with a thin string, waiting. I hesitated, fingertips brushing the edges. Inside were clothes, delicate, soft, and impossibly foreign. A dress that smelled faintly of lavender and an unfamiliar perfume, stockings with seams that pulled at the air like whispers, and shoes that seemed to hum with the idea of another life. I laughed nervously, a short, brittle sound that surprised me. Should I? My heart hammered, not entirely with fear, but a strange, trembling curiosity. I lifted the dress, running my hand along the fabric. It was silky, cool under my touch, and yet it felt like it was waiting for me, like it knew something I didn't. In the mirror, I imagined the folds draping over me, the way I might move if I let myself. And then I tried it. At first, it was awkward. The fabric clung to places I wasn't used to noticing. My reflection morphed with each layer, stockings sliding up my legs, shoes pinching gently at my toes, my hair brushed back, transformed by a small, borrowed clip. I didn't recognize the person in the mirror, but I didn't look away. My voice, when I tested it, sounded strange even to me, a little higher, a little softer, like an echo of someone I'd only glimpsed in dreams. I spent hours moving in front of the mirror, turning slowly, seeing curves and lines I hadn't seen before. Every gesture felt loaded, like each movement was teaching me something about balance, grace, awareness. The small bell of the wind chime outside my window marked the hours, and I noticed the subtle sounds of my own breathing, the scrape of fabric against skin, the quiet rhythm of shoes across the floor. And yet there was fear under it all. What would people think? What would I think? I touched the mirror and my reflection touched back, almost teasing, almost daring me to step further. That night I lay in bed, the dress folded neatly beside me, and I wondered if I would ever sleep the same way again. The thought of tomorrow made my stomach twist. What if the world saw this version of me? I woke to the sound of rain tapping against the window, a soft drum that seemed to echo my heartbeat. Today, the box said, was the first of 14 days. 14 days of becoming, of wearing this other me like a skin I was just beginning to understand. My reflection was no longer just a stranger. She was a companion now, and in her eyes I saw a flicker of fear and a spark of curiosity. I dressed, hesitated, and then stepped out of my room. Every step on the cold floor felt like crossing a line I hadn't dared draw before. The mirror in the hallway caught me for a moment, and I saw the way the light played across my face, how the dress fell perfectly in spite of my unpracticed posture. My heart raced again, a mixture of excitement and dread. Could I really live like this for 2 weeks? Could I survive this delicate, strange, intoxicating truth? The day unfolded in a series of small moments, each sharper and more vivid than the last. The gentle tug of fabric when I moved, the faint brush of hair against my cheek, the way my voice hesitated in the hallway mirror. Every reflection, every shadow felt charged, alive. And in the quiet of my apartment, with the rain drumming like a heartbeat, I realized I was already slipping into something I couldn't name yet. It was terrifying. It was beautiful. And as night fell, I caught my reflection in the living room window, eyes wide, lips slightly parted, and for the first time I whispered her name. It felt like magic and like confession all at once. I didn't know if I was ready for what tomorrow would bring, but I knew I couldn't turn back. Something had shifted, and the world, my world, would never look the same again. The next morning, the city felt different, though I hadn't moved an inch. Light spilled over the streets in long, honeyed ribbons, but instead of feeling like it was just morning, it felt like it was watching me, inspecting me. I hesitated at the edge of my doorway, fingers brushing the hem of the dress, feeling the slight tremble in the fabric and in myself. Stepping outside, the cool air hit my skin and made me shiver, the way it always did, but now it felt sharper, more intimate. Every footstep on the cracked pavement echoed differently, like the world had tuned itself to the sound of my new self, and I noticed small details I'd never cared for before. The flutter of leaves in the trees, the rhythmic drip of water from the gutters, the faint scent of wet asphalt and jasmine. I caught glimpses of my reflection in shop windows and car mirrors, and each time my breath caught. The curve of my waist, the swing of my hips, the way the dress moved with a whisper of motion. It was mesmerizing and terrifying. I kept my gaze forward, afraid someone would look too closely and see what I was becoming. But it wasn't just appearance. My thoughts, my feelings, my sense of who I was, they were shifting too, subtle, creeping changes I couldn't name. I felt lighter and heavier at the same time, a contradiction that made my chest ache. The voice I heard in my own head was softer, yes, but also more curious, more daring, as if it had been waiting for me to notice it. Lunch was a blur of stolen glances at myself in reflective surfaces, the sound of cutlery clinking against plates somehow magnified, the hum of conversation around me muffled and distant. My hands shook slightly as I sipped coffee, the warmth spreading through me, grounding me. I noticed the way the dress's fabric brushed against my thighs with every movement, the subtle shift of stockings when I crossed my legs. It was intimate, this awareness, a private knowledge that nobody else could share. And yet, with every glance, every step, there was fear lurking at the edges of my mind. What if someone laughed? What if I tripped, stumbled, revealed the fragility I carried beneath the surface? Returning home, I lingered by the mirror longer than I intended. My reflection was no longer just a stranger. She was more confident now, more aware, and yet still fragile, a tentative invitation into a world I wasn't sure I belonged to. I ran my hands along my face, tracing the line of my jaw, the curve of my cheek, feeling how strange it was to care so deeply about the reflection of myself. And then I noticed the shoes I wore, how they shifted my stance, how they altered the rhythm of my walk. I laughed softly, a sound that startled even me. Because it was so free, so unguarded. The dress, the hair, the voice, they weren't just costumes anymore. They were tools, keys, little openings into a version of me that had always existed, hidden beneath layers I hadn't wanted to see. Night fell quickly, shadows pooling in the corners of my apartment. I touched the mirror and whispered her name again. This time, it felt less like magic and more like recognition. I could feel the tension in my shoulders easing, the fear receding just enough to let curiosity grow. And yet, as I folded the dress and laid it carefully on the chair, I realized that tomorrow would be harder. Outside, the world would continue, oblivious, and I would have to continue performing, living between reflection and reality, wondering which was more real. Could I really do this? Could I really exist in this new skin and not break? The rain returned, tapping gently against the window pane, a rhythm I now associated with my own pulse. I pressed my forehead to the glass, watching the distorted reflection of streetlights ripple in the water. And somewhere in that quiet, the smallest, sharpest pang of doubt hit me. What if the world never saw me as I saw myself, and what if I couldn't see myself the same way again? The thought lingered, heavy and insistent, as I closed my eyes, wondering what tomorrow's reflection would demand of me. Morning came slower this time, as if the sunlight itself was hesitant to touch me. The apartment felt smaller, tighter, though I knew it hadn't changed. I dressed carefully, lingering over each piece, tracing the seams, the delicate texture, letting the fabric settle over me like a second skin I was learning to inhabit. My reflection in the hallway mirror made me pause. She was no longer just my curiosity or my fear, she was insistently real, staring back with quiet demand. I ran my fingers along my jaw, along my collarbone, noticing how much I had changed in only 2 days, how much I had always hidden from myself. There was power in this awareness, but also a trembling vulnerability, a precariousness that made each step outside feel like stepping across a tightrope. The streets felt sharper today, edges of buildings and cars more precise, sounds more pronounced. I noticed the slight click of my heels on the pavement, the sway of the dress with every stride, and the way strangers' eyes glanced toward me, some fleeting, some lingering just a second too long. Each glance was a spark, igniting a mix of panic and exhilaration that twisted my stomach. I wanted to look away, yet I couldn't. My reflection in the shop windows accompanied me, sometimes flattering, sometimes cruel, revealing angles of myself I had never faced. I felt exposed, but not in a shameful way. In a strange, almost painful clarity, I realized that to feel exposed was to feel alive. At the cafe, I ordered carefully, voice quivering slightly as I tested its new cadence. My hands trembled around the cup, noticing the warmth seep into my fingers, the faint scent of coffee mingling with the soft perfume I now wore like a shield. I caught my reflection in the spoon, distorted, yet undeniably me, and I wondered if this version of myself would ever be accepted outside these small mirrors, outside the private observation of my apartment. My heart ached with longing and uncertainty, a strange cocktail that left me dizzy and restless. Returning home, I lingered in front of the full-length mirror, tracing the curve of my waist and the fall of the dress. My reflection smiled faintly, a ghost of pride I hadn't allowed myself before. I touched her cheek lightly, and for the first time I felt an intimacy that wasn't fear or anxiety. It was recognition, acknowledgement, a fragile bond forming between the me I had always known and the me I was becoming. The stockings brushed against my legs like whispers of encouragement. The shoes, though tight, reminded me that even discomfort could be transformed into grace. And in that moment, I realized that the 14 days were not a punishment, nor a game. They were a revelation. Night fell again, shadows pooling around the corners of the room. I lit a small candle and watched its light dance on the wall, casting fragments of myself into a room that seemed both alien and intimate. I traced the reflection of my hands in the mirror, the fingers slender and unfamiliar, and wondered what tomorrow would bring. Would the world outside acknowledge this self I was learning to inhabit? Or would it remain invisible, leaving me suspended between reality and reflection? The thought lingered like a soft ache, pressing against my chest as I lay back, the dress carefully folded beside me. I could feel it waiting, patient, expectant, and I realized that the journey was just beginning. The fourth morning arrived without ceremony, yet I felt the weight of it pressing against my chest as I dressed. The fabric of the dress slipped over my skin like water, cool and soft, clinging to curves I had never allowed myself to notice. I studied my reflection carefully, noticing the subtle shifts in my posture, the way my shoulders had softened, the slight tilt of my head that gave my face a new expression. I didn't recognize the person entirely, yet there was no fear in her eyes this time, only curiosity and a quiet defiance I didn't know I possessed. Outside, the world seemed both familiar and alien. Every sound, every movement felt magnified. The rustle of leaves in the trees, the low hum of traffic, the distant laughter of strangers, all of it seemed tuned to my presence. My heels clicked with rhythm, punctuating each step with intention, and I noticed how the dress swayed, how the light caught the curves and folds of fabric in a way that felt intimate and alive. A part of me wanted to hide, to vanish back into the safety of my apartment, but another part, smaller, braver, urged me forward. I felt myself growing taller, not in height, but in awareness, in the fragile power of being seen. At the market, I caught my reflection in the dark glass of a refrigerator door. The person staring back at me was poised, deliberate, yet still carrying the echo of unease. I traced the line of my jaw, the curve of my lips, the sweep of my lashes, and felt a pulse of recognition that was both thrilling and terrifying. I realized that each glance in a mirror was a negotiation, a conversation between who I had been and who I was becoming. Each reflection asked a question I didn't yet know how to answer, yet I felt compelled to keep looking, to keep seeing myself. By evening, I had grown more conscious of the smallest details. The scent of my own perfume lingering in the room, the soft brush of hair against my neck, the subtle pinch of the shoes reminding me that grace often comes with discomfort. I practiced small gestures in front of the mirror, tilting my head, shifting my weight, letting my hands fall naturally, and each time I felt a little more like her. A little more like the person I had been too afraid to recognize. And yet, in the quiet moments, doubt returned. Could I really inhabit this version of myself fully? Or was this just a fragile illusion, a borrowed life that would shatter at the first glance from the world outside? Night settled in slowly, the apartment dim and quiet except for the faint ticking of the clock. I stood before the mirror longer than usual, tracing the lines of my reflection with trembling fingers. There was pride there, yes, but also the shadow of fear, the haunting awareness of how much I had changed and how much I still didn't understand. I whispered her name softly, a fragile ritual, a way of claiming her existence in a world that might not yet recognize it. And as I pressed my forehead to the cool glass, I realized that tomorrow would demand more, not just of how I looked, but of how I carried myself, of how I let the world see me. The thought settled like a stone in my chest, heavy and impossible to ignore. Day 5 arrived with a stubborn sun, pouring gold across the floor, yet I felt its warmth differently now, more sharply, as though it was illuminating parts of me I had kept hidden. I dressed slowly, deliberately, letting each piece of fabric settle over my skin. The stockings were tighter today, the shoes slightly less forgiving, but I welcomed the challenge. I studied my reflection in the mirror and noticed a subtle confidence in my stance, the gentle way my shoulders had settled, the way my head tilted just so to catch the light. My reflection no longer seemed surprised by her own presence. She expected it, as if claiming territory I had denied for too long. The city was noisier today, more insistent. Cars honked, people laughed loudly, and every sound pressed against me like a reminder that the world outside didn't pause for self-discovery. But I moved through it with a new awareness, noting how my heels clicked differently on the pavement, how the fabric of the dress whispered against my thighs, how the wind played with my hair and made it dance around my face. I caught glances in shop windows, sometimes startled by the familiar stranger staring back, sometimes fascinated by her poise. For the first time, I considered that she might not just be a reflection of myself, but a part of me I had always ignored, waiting for these days to be noticed. Lunch was solitary, but I felt more present than I ever had in a crowded cafe. My hands wrapped around the warm cup, feeling the subtle scent of coffee mix with my own perfume, and I watched the steam curl into the air, delicate and fleeting. The world around me moved, a blur of motion and sound, and I realized I wasn't just participating. I was observing, noticing the beauty in small, everyday movements. And yet, beneath it all, there was tension. What if this self I had begun to inhabit was too fragile, too easily shattered by a careless word, a sidelong glance, a whisper of judgment? Returning home, I lingered before the full-length mirror longer than usual. My reflection greeted me with a faint, self-aware smile. I traced the contours of my face, the gentle slope of my shoulders, the sway of the dress that now felt almost like a familiar embrace. Each touch, each gesture, was a dialogue between my past and this evolving self. The stockings brushed my legs, the shoes pinched gently, and I realized the discomfort was no longer a barrier but a teacher, instructing me in balance, poise, and patience. I whispered her name, and for the first time it felt like calling a friend home. Night wrapped around me, soft and quiet, and I pressed my forehead to the mirror once more. Shadows pooled in the corners, and the faint tick of the clock filled the silence. I realized that the next day would be a test, not of clothes or reflection or movement, but of the courage to truly exist in this skin outside the confines of my apartment. My reflection and I stared at each other, two halves of a fragile whole, and I wondered, could I step beyond this safety, beyond this private space, and meet the world as her? The thought lingered, heavy and urgent, as I lay in bed, the dress folded neatly beside me, waiting. Morning came with a nervous energy I couldn't shake. The sun spilled across my room, painting everything in golden warmth, yet my chest felt tight, knotted with anticipation. I dressed slowly, deliberately, smoothing the fabric over my skin, feeling how it clung, how it moved, how it transformed me with each layer. My reflection met my gaze and held it firmly this time, unflinching. She was no longer a stranger, but not yet fully me either, an in-between, a whisper of a truth I hadn't dared speak aloud. I ran my fingers along her jawline, along my collarbone, and felt a shiver of recognition. Today, the world might see more than just the surface. Today, I would step further. The streets were alive, the city's pulse pounding in rhythm with my own. Each click of my heels sounded louder than usual, a small drum of defiance and apprehension. I noticed how the dress swayed with each step, the way it caught the sunlight, the subtle brush of air against my legs. A passerby glanced at me, and I held her gaze for just a moment too long. My heart stuttered, and I realized that the act of being seen, truly seen, carried a weight I hadn't fully comprehended. But there was also exhilaration, a quiet thrill in owning the space I moved through, in inhabiting a self I had long denied. At the park, I found a quiet bench and sat, watching the world move around me. Children laughed, leaves rustled, a dog barked somewhere nearby, and I felt both detached and deeply alive. I noticed the way the sunlight kissed my skin, how the dress shifted slightly with each movement, how my hands rested delicately on my lap. Each sensation was amplified, intimate, grounding me in this new reality. And yet, fear lingered at the edges. What if the world rejected me? What if I faltered, stumbled, or failed to maintain the grace I was slowly learning to inhabit? Returning home, I paused longer than usual before the mirror. My reflection greeted me with a quiet understanding, a subtle strength I hadn't noticed before. I traced my fingers along her cheek, along the line of her neck, feeling an intimacy that was almost sacred. The shoes pinched slightly, reminding me that beauty and discomfort were often inseparable. The stockings whispered against my skin, an ongoing reminder of the careful attention, the patience, the mindfulness this transformation demanded. And as I whispered her name softly, I realized the journey was no longer just about appearance. It was about courage, about the willingness to see, to feel, to exist fully in a world that might not yet recognize me. Night settled gently, shadows pooling around the corners of the apartment. I stood before the mirror one last time, touching her face lightly, whispering, "We're almost there." Tomorrow felt pivotal, heavy with expectation. Would I be ready to step even further, to let the world outside see the full measure of this new self? The question lingered, pressing against my chest as I lay down, the dress folded neatly beside me, waiting, patient, insistent. And in the quiet, I felt the first real tremor of what it meant to be not just reflected, but recognized. The seventh morning carried a tension I could almost taste. Light poured in unevenly through the blinds, catching dust motes in the air, and I felt my pulse tighten with a mixture of excitement and dread. I dressed deliberately, smoothing the dress over my skin, tugging the stockings just so, sliding my feet into the shoes that had begun to feel like extensions of myself. My reflection in the mirror no longer startled me. She moved with a quiet confidence, a poise that mirrored the subtle changes in my own posture, in the tilt of my head, in the way I held my shoulders. And yet, there was an edge of vulnerability, a reminder that this life, this version of me, was still fragile, still tethered to fear. The city was alive with its usual chaos, yet everything seemed sharper, more immediate, more pronounced. Each sound echoed differently, the rhythmic click of my heels against concrete, the murmur of conversations, the sudden whoosh of passing cars. I noticed the subtle sway of the dress, how the wind teased my hair, how sunlight danced across the fabric. For the first time, I felt a small thrill of daring, a sense that I was stepping into a version of reality that demanded attention, that required presence. I was no longer merely moving through the world. I was inhabiting it, and it was responding to me in ways I had never imagined. At the bookstore, I lingered in front of the glass doors, catching my reflection in the window. The stranger I once feared was now deliberate, aware, poised. I traced the curve of my jaw, the slope of my shoulders, the delicate fall of the dress, and a quiet ache of recognition filled me. Each gesture, each glance, each breath was charged with an intimacy I hadn't known existed. And yet, beneath the surface, doubt still lingered. Could I continue to inhabit this self when outside eyes might be harsh, careless, or dismissive? Could I hold her, protect her, and let her exist fully in the world beyond my mirrors? Returning home, I moved slowly, almost reverently, toward the mirror. I traced my reflection's hands with my own, marveling at the subtle grace in her movements. The stockings whispered against my legs, the shoes pinched in the right places, reminding me that this transformation was as much about discipline as desire, about mindfulness as discovery. And as I whispered her name softly, a ritual now as familiar as breathing, I realized that tomorrow might be the day I truly stepped beyond the confines of observation, beyond the private practice of identity, into a world that demanded recognition and courage. Night came quietly, shadows deepening in the corners of the apartment. I pressed my forehead to the mirror, breathing slowly, deliberately, feeling the pulse of both fear and anticipation. Tomorrow would demand more than clothing, more than reflection. It would demand trust in her, in me, in the fragile balance we were learning to navigate. The thought pressed against my chest, insistent and heavy, as I lay down, the dress folded neatly beside me. And in the quiet, I realized that the journey was far from over. It had only begun to test the strength of who I was, and who I might yet become. The 8th morning broke softly, with a pale light spilling over the floor. I dressed with a deliberate slowness, letting the fabric settle, the stockings slide, the shoes hug my feet in that familiar, almost intimate pinch. My reflection greeted me without surprise, her eyes calm but sharp, as if she had been waiting for me to finally understand. I ran my fingers along her jawline, along my collarbone, and felt the subtle tremor of recognition ripple through me. Today, I felt more like her than I had on any of the previous mornings, yet a whisper of uncertainty clung to the edges, a reminder that this self, however realized, was still fragile, still untested. The streets were awake with their usual rhythm, but I moved through them differently now. Every sound seemed magnified, the rustle of leaves, the distant laughter, the hum of engines. Yet I felt attuned, present, as if every detail mattered in a way it hadn't before. My heels clicked with quiet authority, the dress swaying gently with each step, catching sunlight in a way that made my stomach twist with a mix of pride and fear. I noticed the fleeting glances from passers-by, the subtle curiosity in their eyes, and I realized I no longer wanted to hide. The act of being seen was no longer terrifying, it was a declaration. At the cafe, I paused to watch myself in the reflection of the window. The stranger who had once startled me now seemed deliberate, measured, poised. I traced her face with my eyes, memorizing the angles and shadows, feeling a growing intimacy that was both grounding and exhilarating. Each gesture, each movement, each small breath became a language I was learning to speak fluently. And yet, doubt lingered beneath it all, the quiet fear that the world might reject her, or worse, that I might falter in protecting the balance between who I had been and who I was becoming. Evening settled gently, the light fading in long streaks across the room. I lingered before the mirror, tracing the lines of her face, the fall of the dress, the delicate whisper of stockings against skin. The shoes pinched slightly, a familiar reminder that growth often came with discomfort. I whispered her name softly, a ritual now comforting, anchoring, a quiet promise to keep her visible, keep her alive. I knew tomorrow might demand more than I had faced yet, a confrontation not just with my reflection, but with the world outside these walls. The thought pressed against me, urgent and insistent, as I lay down, the dress folded neatly beside me, waiting, patient, and silent. The 9th morning carried a weight I could almost taste. Light seeped through the blinds like liquid gold, yet I felt a tension that pressed against my chest and made my movements slower, more deliberate. I dressed carefully, letting the fabric cling, the stockings whisper across my legs, the shoes hug my feet in that familiar, intimate way. My reflection greeted me with quiet authority, her eyes steady and unwavering, as if she knew something I hadn't yet realized. I traced her jawline, the slope of her shoulders, the gentle curve of her waist, and felt a surge of both pride and vulnerability. Tomorrow would be the culmination of these 14 days, and suddenly the thought of it made the air feel heavy, the room smaller, as if the world itself were holding its breath. The city felt sharper today, each sound more vivid, each motion more precise. My heels clicked with a rhythm that seemed to echo my heartbeat. The dress swaying around my legs like a soft, deliberate statement. Strangers glanced my way, some briefly, some with a lingering curiosity, and I noticed the subtle shifts in my posture, the deliberate grace of my gestures. For the first time, I felt as though I truly belonged in this skin, walking this delicate line between past and present. And yet, a knot of fear remained, twisting low in my stomach. Could I truly inhabit her fully? Could I let the world see the complete version of this self, without flinching? At the park, I found a quiet bench and sat, watching the world move with a clarity that left me both exhilarated and exhausted. Each rustle of leaves, each distant laugh, each echoing footstep became an intimate lesson in presence, a reminder that being seen was not only about appearance but about courage. My reflection in the window across the path caught me mid-glance, serene, deliberate, almost daring me to step further. I touched my own face lightly, feeling the soft warmth of skin, the subtle weight of awareness pressing in, and realized that tomorrow I would face not just the challenge of the world, but the challenge of fully trusting her, fully trusting myself. Night fell slowly, the apartment darkening except for the faint tick of the clock and the soft glow of a lamp in the corner. I lingered before the mirror, tracing her face, the curve of the dress, the subtle lines of her posture. I whispered her name as I had each night, but tonight it carried urgency, a promise, a quiet plea. Tomorrow was the final step, the test of courage and acceptance, and I pressed my forehead to the cool glass, wondering if I could truly meet the world as her. The thought settled deep in my chest, heavy and insistent, as I folded the dress with care, the anticipation of the coming day echoing in every heartbeat, in every breath. The 10th morning arrived like a held breath, the light spilling through the blinds with a quiet intensity that seemed almost ceremonial. I dressed with reverence, every movement deliberate, every fabric, every seam, every soft whisper of stocking against skin grounding me in this version of myself I had grown to know so intimately. My reflection met my gaze with calm assurance, no longer tentative, no longer questioning. She was fully present, fully alive, and for the first time I felt a sense of completion, though tinged with the fragile weight of anticipation. Today was not just another day. It was the reckoning, the moment where reflection and reality would meet without compromise. Stepping outside, the city seemed transformed. The wind carried the scent of rain from earlier, the sun glinted off windows like shards of light, and each sound, the soft chatter of neighbors, the distant hum of traffic, the crunch of my heels against pavement, was amplified, intimate, and alive. I walked deliberately, aware of every sway of the dress, every tilt of my head, every subtle rhythm in my steps. I was not hiding. I was not afraid. For the first time, I carried her fully, and the world met me with a mixture of indifference and fleeting curiosity, but it no longer mattered. What mattered was the quiet power in inhabiting myself without apology, without hesitation, without fear. At the cafe, I paused before the glass door, watching my reflection ripple alongside the world beyond. She looked steady, poised, deliberate. I traced the line of her jaw, the slope of her shoulders, the gentle arc of her hips, and felt an intimacy that was almost sacred. The world might not understand, might not recognize, but I did. I was no longer a stranger to myself, no longer a visitor in my own body. Each glance, each breath, each subtle gesture carried meaning, a testimony to the fragile courage that had grown in 14 days. And I realized, finally, that she had always been there, waiting patiently for me to meet her, for me to allow her presence to transform the way I moved through life. Evening settled over the city, long shadows stretching across streets and sidewalks. I returned home and lingered before the mirror one last time, tracing her face, her hands, the sway of her dress, the subtle pinch of her shoes. I whispered her name softly, reverently, and felt a sense of gratitude, awe, and quiet triumph. 14 days had taught me to notice, to feel, to inhabit. They had shown me that transformation was not merely about appearance, but about courage, awareness, and acceptance. And as I pressed my forehead to the glass, I no longer feared what tomorrow might bring. I had met her fully, embraced her completely, and in doing so, I had met myself. The dress lay folded neatly beside me, patient, silent, a witness to the journey that had reshaped not only the reflection in the mirror, but the very core of who I was. I breathed deeply, savoring the quiet, the stillness, the fragile victory of existence fully claimed. The world outside would continue, indifferent or curious, but it no longer mattered. I had learned to carry her, to see her, to love her presence in ways that were steady, deliberate, and true. And for the first time in my life, I felt whole,